What stories are out there that we can kind of invest our hearts in today that we know will be passed on to our children and our grandchildren? Because I mean, that's what we call our traditions. That's what we call our sacred stories. You know what I mean? And it's like, this is one of
Definitely.
those sacred things, care of the ocean, of Mother Ocean, to our children and our grandchildren. So, and not only, not only is it a story of like care and love, but you've got this progression for profit, for health, for, for rejuvenation of culture, for
Sure.
food scarcity, going away. You've got all
Right.
these solutions wrapped up into this one big idea that is a looming hole in permaculture. And when you look up ocean or sea or marine and the word permaculture, there's really hardly anything, but there is one thing. There is one thing there, and that is you. And so
Well,
it's
thank you.
like you are standing there as you're the trailblazer. And so it is an honor to be talking to the leader in ocean permaculture currently. I mean, you're leading the charge. I brought it up in my books and stuff and tried to study it and everything as best as I can, but you're leading the charge. So it is an absolute pleasure to have you on here and talk to you.
Well, thank you, Matt. I appreciate that, and it's great to connect with you as well. I feel as though we've got a great opportunity to apply deep permaculture principles to life in the ocean and the ocean ecosystems. And by understanding those better, we can learn how to live in harmony with them. And I think that's a huge opportunity, because the fate and the survival of 3 billion people on the planet depends on protein from the ocean. And if we can't make that sustainable, then we're going to be dealing with dire consequences. And turning that around, ensuring enough food for people and enough food for the ecosystems is vitally important for our own survival of our civilization, I would say.
And it's almost like this is a light switch we haven't even flipped on as humans yet. And it's literally that easy too. It's almost like a light switch.
Yeah, I think connecting the fate of the Earth and her ecosystems with the fate of civilization is something that hasn't been fully drawn. But I think there are a couple of books that touch on it. I mean, Soil is a bit like that, and the whole notion. There was this premise by several books actually that every major collapse of civilization tended to be preceded by a collapse of the soil, and that fundamentally it's the collapse of the soil that results in the collapse of the civilization. So if we extend that metaphor to soils and seas, it's when either one or both collapse that we lose our civilization. And literally, I think there's an existential challenge for us to keep the life in the seas and the soils alive and thriving in order to ensure that our civilization will continue.
Wow. So let's just start at the beginning. Let's introduce everyone to this concept of marine permaculture and what it is, how it's both a technique and it's also a concept. Because most people, I think that they're like, oh, all right, so you're gonna clean up the ocean and let things just, happen. But it is not like that. It is quite exciting because it can involve all these people.
Well, that's very true. And it's at a local scale. I mean, we've got more than 100,000 indigenous farmers. We're talking about subsistence farmers in the Philippines that grow a hectare of seaweed, and that's their survival, right? And for them, they're living on the front lines of climate disruption. The waters become too warm, the nutrient levels are too low. They cannot produce the crops that they had in decades past. And so that's a real challenge to enable their way of life to continue and to address the nutrient value chain gaps that have been introduced by climate disruption, and to restore overturning circulation so they get enough cool water with the right nutrient levels so that these seaweed farms can continue to thrive. And that's the real challenge, is to bring that back, because right now their communities are collapsing. The communities are not having the economic sustainability to even keep them running. The kids have to go off to the city. I mean, it's just, there's not a model for continuing those communities. And so until we can get, irrigation for seaweed farms is like irrigation for regular farms. If you have the difference between dry cropping and irrigation is enormous, especially if you have to survive droughts. And so we're bringing irrigation to seaweed farms for the first time. And we're able to give, there's in Indonesia, there are millions of seaweed farmers. And so being able to have that continue means a way of life for millions of people. And furthermore, these seaweed farms and kelp forests are habitat for billions of forage fish. And that's the base of the food chain for the protein source for 3 billion people.
Awesome. Can you define for us what ocean irrigation is? Because there's
yes
for it.
Right. And so it's a way of thinking of it like irrigating a farm, drip irrigation. But effectively, when the water's too warm and aren't enough nutrients, you need to restore enough upwelling that we can actually bring the deep, cool water up to the surface. And that's what the seaweed lives off of. And so what's worked in previous decades no longer works. And so that's a bit of a challenge. And so our challenge and our opportunity is to make that work smoothly again. It's really filling the value chain gaps that climate disruption has caused. And once that works smoothly, people's livelihoods can be restored. And by the way, we can restore the sardine fisheries that have been decimated. And partly they've been decimated from the climate disruption as well. These people didn't create the climate problem, but they're feeling the brunt of it. They have no crop insurance. There is no backup. Their survival depends on these crops continuing. And I'm shocked at the number of suicides in India that farmers commit suicide in India because they have no backup. And that's what we're dealing with, people on the edge of climate disruption. And so that's the problem. The thing that makes me enthusiastic about marine permaculture is that not only does it address these problems, but it ends up regenerating ecosystems in the ocean in terms of, first of all, the kelp forest down in Tasmania that's been mostly depleted can be regenerated with this mechanism. That creates habitat for forage fish as well. And it keeps an ecosystem alive that otherwise is predicted to collapse over the next 2 decades. By ensuring that can continue, we can actually ensure that we're able to keep those forage fish, game fish, apex predators. They all depend upon these kind of ecosystems for their survival. So it's really the base of the entire pyramid of life, if you would, in the ocean. This tree of life. It's critical to have the base of the tree be healthy and stable.
So many of us have heard about the Atlantic current slowing, but this has more to do with upwelling, right? And so are you replacing upwellings that have slowed or tailed off, or are you creating new upwellings, or both?
It's restoring regionally the upwelling, the overturning circulation. Normally, offshore you get offshore winds that will bring water up to the surface. For example, the summer winds off the coast of California with the Coriolis forces, they cause a lot of upwelling to occur in good years. Now, in 2016, that upwelling partially failed. The water was really warm, and we had the big warm blob. And when the water is warm, it's even harder to get the upwelling going. And that's the problem. If the winds aren't strong enough, or if the water is too warm, the upwelling doesn't happen, and 95% of the seaweed dies, as has died off Northern California, north of San Francisco. We've lost 95% of the Neurocystis kelp forest, and it's not coming back until we've taken care of 99% of the sea urchin problem that's come out as a result of this global warming scenario. So this warm current that started, back before 2013, it's actually caused a lot of problems up and down the coast, and those need to be addressed systematically. And marine permaculture is one way of addressing it locally.
So what have you proposed for the urchin barrens?
Well, the state of California Fish and Wildlife has been in discussions with the idea of harvesting. I mean, the urchin barrens are like zombies. They're walking around on the seafloor, starving, asking for more brains. And fundamentally, there's no kelp left to eat. And so one approach is to harvest some of them, rehabilitate them, and that means feeding them kelp, and then shipping them to Japan and California as uni for sushi, which is high value. But to do that, we need a lot of kelp. And where better to grow that kelp than on a marine permaculture offshore Northern California? We can grow kelp in 90 days. The challenge and the opportunity is you're not going to eliminate all the sea urchins overnight because they're just going to crawl back in. You take a few, you harvest those, you rehabilitate them by feeding them kelp that we grow offshore on floating platforms. And so we have the substrate, we have the upwelling, we can get the kelp to grow on our platform. We can partially harvest the kelp and feed that kelp to the urchins, and they will rehabilitate. They'll get plump and juicy and ready to go. And that's those rehabilitated urchins are marketable in food markets across the world. So that is a good model, but we need to have the kelp to do it. And marine permaculture is probably the most sustainable way to grow that kelp locally and without huge transportation costs, provide it to the urchin rehabilitation centers. We use endogenous energy. That means wave energy, solar energy, wind energy to bring water up from the deep to the kelp forest itself. And just like a drip irrigation system on land, we use a drip irrigation system and diffuser hoses to little holes to distribute the deep, cool seawater to the kelp forest. And so literally it's a drip irrigation system for a kelp forest.
Wow. I cannot wait to see this come to California in forest. This is really exciting because I learned about this first when I read Seasteading. And
yes.
That book has started so many different ideas in my head and a lot more questions. But the number one thing that I've wanted to see is working examples. And you've won some recognition for the work you've done proving this model, right?
Well, yes, we've been developing it. We've received awards from several foundations, and we've also been featured in a new documentary called 2040, which just was released in Australia this month and has already hit #9 in the box office against Hollywood feature films and everything. So, and we're going to do a showing in New York, I think, over the next few days. And at the end of June, there'll be a showing in DC as well. These are like preview screenings, but it's going to be released, I believe, later this year in America. And it's this great, hopeful view of the future in 2040. And so I think these visions are critical. And one of the 5 future technologies is marine permaculture, and it's all about regenerating life in the ocean. And so it's this wonderful, hopeful view of the future, which is great. And relating to seasteading, we firmly believe that marine permaculture is the reason for seasteading to exist. In other words, first you build the mariculture, and then you build the communities that support the mariculture. So we're really looking forward to working with the seasteading community to make this become a vital economic force.
Absolutely. So that is so incredible. My first thought was like #9 in Australia, marine permaculture. It's like you're like, not only are you coming from the edges of permaculture, but you're coming straight to the front. And then you may be one of the people that really breaks permaculture into the mainstream for a lot of people. This is amazing.
We really hope so. No, it's great. It's I'll tell you, going to Australia is a real joy, and learning the deep principles of permaculture and applying them to marine ecosystems is incredibly rewarding. There's so much to be done, and the analogies are just incredible. I mean, from soils to seas, the principles apply across ecosystems, across the known universe. And that's what's incredible, is that it works so well. Understanding how we can live sustainably with the forests of Tasmania, as well as living sustainably in the forests of the kelp. I mean, they're both there, they're equally vibrant. And in fact, the diversity of species is absolutely critical. So the multi-species benefits accrue, I think, at least as much in the sea as they do on land. The fish end up fertilizing the kelp, and the kelp are the seeding grounds for the eggs. That's where the herring lay their eggs. And I've got a story to tell from Hokkaido, Japan. In 1897, the Japanese in Hokkaido harvested 1 million tons of herring off the northwest coast of Hokkaido. And this they did every year, year in and year out. The herring would go between the Sea of Okhotsk in Russia to Hokkaido, Japan, and back in a migratory cycle. And imagine 1 million tons of herring being harvested each year. They would lay their eggs in the Saccharina kelp forest in the north of Hokkaido. And it wasn't until 1953 that this incredible school of herring became extinct because of overfishing. And so they lost all the herring, but the real surprise was that a few decades later, the Saccharina kelp forest was decimated. And they went back and did isotopic studies of the Saccharina kelp in the recent past and all the way back in the early 1900s. And they found that in the early 1900s, the Saccharina kelp forest was being fertilized by the herring themselves. It was the nitrogen given off by the herring and everything that really kept that forest alive. So this idea that first the herring ecosystem collapsed and then the Saccharina kelp forest ecosystem collapsed, that these two ecosystems are connected is really vital. And what we see as an opportunity is with marine permaculture to regenerate the Saccharina kelp forest off Hokkaido and then regenerate the herring ecosystem and rebuild it. One of my advisors from Caltech, Dick Feynman, liked to say, you don't understand a system until you've built it. And we like to say, you don't understand an ecosystem until you've rebuilt it. And by that, I mean regenerate the same ecosystem services offshore in a marine permaculture. And that's our vision, to be able to understand ecosystems well enough to regenerate them and enable them to be climate resilient.
So I'm so fascinated by this idea of bringing the heron back to there. Do you think that they'd have to be like trained to do the migration pattern that they used to, or do you think that the natural currents following the path of nutrients and warming will just lead them to do that?
That's a good question. You know, when there are billions of herring, what I realized is the herring or the sardines create an ecosystem. The school itself is an ecosystem. If you ever go scuba diving with a massive school of fish, you go in, you can't even see through the school of fish. You go in and you dive down and you ended up being surrounded by a sphere of fish. Like they're a certain distance away from you, a few meters. But imagine being in a bubble of fish and all you can see in all directions is fish. And that is what it's like to be inside a massive school of fish ecosystem. It's just amazing, absolutely incredible. It's happened to me a few times in my life. And I realized then that when you have billions of fish, they create their own ecosystem. And that's fundamental. But to bootstrap that ecosystem, we need habitat. So when you don't have billions of fish, you need a kelp forest. Because the kelp forest, those leaves are just the right size for a fish to hide behind. You know, it's just the right size structure, and it's self-assembling and it's regenerating. And so, and it's producing oxygen, right? And food and habitat, all these things. So the kelp forest is the self-assembling habitat that bootstraps the forage fish. It's the habitat for the forage fish ecosystem. So it's really this virtuous spiral that we need to regenerate in the oceans. And it starts with primary production. And that is the macroalgae habitat, microalgae food for these forage fish, enabling the ecosystems to thrive fundamentally. Well, the potential is enormous. we start with food. 3 billion people on the planet depend on that. But even more, of all the animal protein in the world, only one small set of animal protein actually is associated with increased longevity, and that is small forage fish. So when it comes to health, sardines, anchovies, maybe suitably and sustainably raised salmon, those are the fish that are neuroprotective. They actually confer more neuroprotective benefits than the hazards of heavy metals. So if you want a great cognitive health span and a healthy lifespan, forage fish are the answer. The lowly sardines, the anchovies, and the salmon. So these are examples of forage fish species that are associated with health and longevity. So it's really a huge factor. And as this comes out more and more, along with bits of seaweed, I mean, we had seaweed just yesterday and it was wonderful. We harvested some seaweed offshore. And I'll just tell you, we had some Australian seaweed farmers come, and they made this amazing sesame oil saute that's to die for. It's like, get me more of that seaweed salad. That was incredible. But, the amazing thing is the ancient allele of humans 100,000 years ago, they were a very small group of humans living in southern Africa, and they were by the coast, and they were living probably in caves. And their diet was a coastal diet, and it was shellfish, perhaps seaweed, yams, and vegetables. And that diet continues to this day in Western Nigeria, where amazingly, the diet seems to be a key factor in their completely decoupling the Alzheimer's gene from the phenotype of Alzheimer's. And so this is just one example. Another comes from Dr. Jane Teese, who's worked at Harvard Medical School. She taught there at UMass and in South Carolina. And she spent 40 years studying breast cancer around the world and found that, well, in countries like Thailand, the level of breast cancer is 7 times lower. And they developed a mouse model for this as an experiment. And they actually just fed the test mice an ounce or 2 equivalent in humans of the seaweed mixture. And it cut the breast cancer tumor incidence by more than an order of magnitude. I mean, to me, that was amazing. That the neuroprotective benefits and secondarily the antioxidant benefits, phytonutrients and omega-3s, had such a profound effect on so many of the critical diseases that are devastating mankind today. So this non-Western diet of seaweed and fish has amazing benefits for humans. And that's just one of a dozen value chains that we can identify from seaweed and fish and marine permaculture.
And how much does this cost, per square meter or for, half a hectare to set up these seaweed farms? Just to give someone an idea, they're like, how could I start one of these? How much money do you really need?
Well, so if we were doing 100 hectares at a time, today in our development mode, it's more than $10 a square meter, which is pretty darn expensive. However, we are going through that cost reduction process as we speak, improving the technology, making it smoother, making it run smoother. And by the time we build 100 of these, our goal is to be below $1 per square meter for a marine permaculture. And that should be, we should be able to earn that much in seaweed and fish each year. So the capital cost should be manageable in the next few years. The challenge that we're facing is that today in the Philippines and tomorrow in other regions, it's going to be harder and harder for those seaweed farms to exist. We've even seen off the west coast of Australia, they lost 1,000 square kilometers of Eclonia kelp forest just since 2011. And it switched like this. It went like in one warm year, it was like this bistable switch, and it went to turf. And we lost all that habitat in just a year or two, and it hasn't come back. It's kind of like Easter Island. It's stable as a rainforest, and it's stable with no trees whatsoever. But it's up to us to get that system into to enable to regenerate it to the point where it's able to be stable on its own. And
Very
I
difficult.
think a key part of that is, we've got to, like it or not, if we're going to keep these kelp forests going and these seaweed farms, we're going to need to restore the overturning that once was, the overturning circulation. And so we use renewable energy to do that.
Do you think that a fishing moratorium is, because I've called for temporary moratoriums on fish while we create balance and bring back the predators and observe the way predators interact with these regenerated populations, so that we could start imitating them and regeneratively grazing from those populations. Because on land, we've got great examples of all the documentation, all the bird watchers, the Audubon Society participating with the hunters, doing all the research so they can give accurate numbers to the hunters, so they can set a precise hunting quota so that it will regenerate the population rather than decimate it or let it go too far and then let diseases start to try to manage it. Because something needs to manage things to that sweet Goldilocks level. And so, I feel like we need something like that, for
well, so we have some great examples of cat shares in Chile, and the Chilean cat shares work like this. The resources boards figure out the sustainable harvest of sardines each year, for example, and then all of the ships in Chile are registered, and according to their tonnage, they get a percentage of the pie. They get a slice of the pie. And they've got 6 or 9 months to go and get that quota, and then it gets weighed when it comes back. But then it turns what was a cutthroat industry into a cooperative industry. And the fishing cooperatives now meet every month, and they get together and they talk about how to make the pie bigger. And that's what marine permaculture is all about. How do we make the pie bigger? And we shift the demand from non-sustainable fish to forage fish like sardines, anchovies, salmon. We shift that demand and we get the neuroprotective benefits, we get the health benefits, and without all the heavy metals. And so that's a key thing, is to shift demand over to sustainable fish that's healthier and more sustainable. And we're planning to grow billions more sardines on marine permacultures with no nets, no fish feed, and ultimately no deep water moorings. And what that means is that we have a new model for regenerating enough food in the ocean for people and for nature. And that's the key, is really making the pie bigger. And it's about regenerating the life that once was in our ecosystems before industrial practices.
I love it. It's ocean care. I mean, like,
it really
that's what it
is.
They get together and share their care for the ocean, and it carries on into the future.
In fact, in Australia, we've been calling it caring for sea country. And sea country is the indigenous term for the kelp forests of the ocean, the seaweed forests, even the coral. And so caring for sea country is all about bringing back the traditional owners' knowledge of the equilibrium in the sea, and using that and embracing it and extending it to regenerate ecosystems in the ocean, regenerate life in the ocean based on known ecosystems that thrive.
Wow, that's really special. I mean, the indigenous the Aboriginal Australians have had such a traditionally incredible and unique relationship with the ocean. I read Dark Emu and learned about how they were partnering with the killer whales, the orcas, to do hunting, and they would drive the fish towards the shore in the shallows, and then they would hunt and they would feed the orcas. And the orcas, the relationship went on until a Western whaler killed the head of the pod of that orcas that was actually passing down the tradition. So incredibly sad, but at the same time, it's this window into what is really possible. And so I'm really excited. That's so awesome that there's that honoring connection. That is so wonderful to hear. So I've heard from a couple people that upwelling can be dangerous. So what are they talking about, and how can we kind of like buffer against any of those potential problems?
Well, the first thing is to understand that in this tropical and subtropical ocean, we've lost about 40% of upwelling due to climate disruption, due to the 93% of global warming that's going into the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
So the first and foremost, we're talking about restoring ecosystem services. And restoring means restoring the upwelling that once was. Before we had this warm layer of water on the surface, it's now 1.1 degrees Celsius on average warmer. Here in my hometown of Woods Hole, it's 2 degrees Celsius warmer. And down in Tasmania, where they're losing the kelp forest, it's 3 to 4 degrees Celsius warmer than it was historically. And so this huge marine heat wave is having profound effects throughout the oceans, from the kelp forests of Tasmania to the Great Barrier Reef off Queensland to Hawaii, where I lived in Hawaii for 3 years. I never thought I would see coral bleaching there. And yet we had 50% bleaching during 2015, 2016 time period. Really, really serious and dangerous, quite frankly. We're flirting with collapsing that ecosystem. Charlie Barrens said, each of the 5 major extinctions in the history of the Earth has been preceded by the extinction of the coral reef. It is the canary in the coal mine. It's what's going to determine, that Anthropocene is we're on the edge of it, right? And our opportunity, well, I view marine permaculture as one of our key opportunities to stave off the Anthropocene, to keep most of nature alive on our watch. And it's because we've got to address that problem. So when you talk about restoring ecosystem services, we've got to look at the loss of overturning circulation that's happened, and then view this in the context of restoring it locally so that regionally we can have reasonable temperatures, reasonable nutrient levels. That said, if you had a harmful algal bloom off the coast of California, like has happened in previous years, you wouldn't want to make it worse. So we monitor for that. And if there is a harmful algal bloom happening, we'll monitor downstream. If it's getting worse, we can turn off the pump. We can just, no more upwelling. And till the bloom goes away, that works fine. So we have monitors, we can watch for that. It's always good to have safeguards and to be looking for any side effects. But fundamentally, we're mimicking natural ecosystems. And in this case, it's about identifying the nutrient value chain gap that's occurred from climate disruption. And that's specifically upwelling and restoring overturning circulation, particularly in tropical and subtropical waters.
So these algae blooms are a product of heat and a lack of oxygen, right? And then it goes into
oftentimes, yes. Nutrients are a part of it. So we go off the coast of Oregon, right? And so human eutrophication is a key factor. It tends to be along the coastline. It tends to be on the 1% of the ocean that's eutrophied. Keep in mind, 99% of the ocean is oligotrophic. That's the opposite. That's low nutrients. In fact, in Japan, they talk about oligotrophication as a problem, which is a mouthful. But what it means is their bays are becoming so low in nutrients, they're losing all their fish. And so they're actually having the opposite problem of trying to figure out how to keep their fish going, and they can't get enough nutrients to keep their fish populations going. So it's actually been a big problem, the opposite problem in Japan. And it's one that we can address with marine permaculture. That's why a lot of times we'll take marine permaculture offshore, where you're dealing with oligotrophic conditions. You're not near a human eutrophied zone. And this is a place where we can regionally restore some of the kelp forest ecosystem services that have been lost off the coast of Northern California and off of Tasmania.
That's interesting. So I had a suggestion when I looked at Bren Smith's system. I grew up on the Long Island Sound. So when I saw he was working there, I was like, what? But like initially, my first instinct is like, okay, so we've got all these excess nutrients and we've got all, this carbon. It's like, well, you would just turn it into soil. And so when there's a lack of nutrients, my instinct is always like, well, what are the ocean soils like, right? There's 4, major maritime soils. So it's like, I was suggesting like growing and then cutting and then letting it break down in place or something like that. Would that create more of a problem though? for temporary time periods?
Well, it depends on where you do it. We're looking at deep ocean areas that are further offshore, and there partial harvest makes a lot of sense. But there's a notion of a series of refinement processes. I mean, there are really helpful materials like fucoidan, for example, is known to be really effective against many diseases and even symptoms of arthritis. And so many companies nutraceutical companies will harvest these phytonutrients, antioxidants, and omega-3 fatty acids that are available in seaweeds. And so a partial harvest involves this process of getting the high value nutrients from the seaweed. And then secondarily, there are many benefits like hydrocolloids, carbohydrates, et cetera, that are in the seaweeds. And then finally, the residues that are left over from that process, not to mention food itself. We do a lot of harvest for the direct food source. The residues that aren't used for food, feed, or fertilizer, we can actually generate a blue carbon sink. And that blue carbon sink, these seaweed residues drop 500 meters a day. And after 2 days, they're down below 1,000 meters. If they're down 1,000 meters, the median time to overturning to outcropping again is centuries to millennia. And that means that we've generated a real blue carbon sink. Now, this is offshore, it's in deep water, but keep in mind the middle and deep ocean has 50 times as much carbon as the entire atmosphere of the Earth. So if we do a responsible job of developing blue carbon sinks and distributing it throughout the ocean, the drawdown that's needed, there's truly enormous room in the ocean to absorb the excess carbon of the atmosphere. Now, we should reduce the carbon intensity of our civilization first and foremost by a factor of 5. But techniques like marine permaculture can to, first of all, reduce the intensity of our civilization in terms of its carbon use, but then secondly, to draw down the remaining carbon using techniques like marine permaculture and other approaches in a sustainable way that's feeding the planet and ecosystems at the same time. So we're doing one project in Tasmania where we're working side by side along with salmon aquaculture farms. And part of it is that the kelp forest has higher water temperatures and lower nutrient levels than it needs in order to survive. And so if we grow the kelp forest right next to and on the salmon aquaculture, we can draw down some of those nutrients and actually help the kelp forest grow. And if we partially harvest that kelp forest, we're now removing nitrogen and phosphorus from the ocean. So we're reducing the impact of the salmon aquaculture on the environment. At the same time, those kelps can go onto food, feed, and fertilizer. We can actually use them as mulch and as compost for agriculture on land. And furthermore, and this is not that broadly known, these seaweed extracts are a great form of root density, and we can increase the flowering of rice, of vegetables, even grain crops. It's just amazing. I mean, soybeans, it's just like between 11 and 50% higher yields using seaweed foliar biostimulants. So that increase in yield is transformational. Imagine, right, today, you wouldn't think of running a winery in California without using seaweed foliar biostimulants to increase the number of grapes and the yield. That's standard practice in the industry today. But why isn't it being used for vegetables? Why isn't it being used for row crops? We've seen less than 1% more. Imagine in India, 11% more rice means 100 million more people get fed. I mean, it's huge and fits from this thing, just about. So there's some kind of interaction between the seaweed foliar biostimulant, and it gets into the stomata of the leaves, and it actually upregulates gene expression and upregulates flowering. And so this is a really transformational product that we think is going to have enormous benefits throughout agriculture.
Amazing. So as we remove that problem, we turn it into like this ultimate benefit. that we've been neglecting. I love it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
We go from waste products into high value.
So could we apply this idea maybe on the farthest edges of the dead zone or right outside the dead zone in the Gulf to start taking up those excess nutrients and then start working our way in? Would we need to aerate or oxygenate the dead zone? What do you think?
Well, I think we could start further upstream. There are actually freshwater analogs to marine permaculture that could work in the rivers themselves, and they could actually draw down the nutrient levels in the rivers before it ever gets to the sea. Wouldn't that be great? So we should be looking at that, and we've been studying plants like azolla and related plants that do a great job of drawing down, and they can double in 3 days. So it's really a highly valuable way of addressing the problem upstream, which is a great start. And then furthermore, I think we can begin to address the edges of the dead zone, so to speak, with techniques like this, because the marine permacultures are increasing the oxygen in the ocean. They are actually increasing the oxygenation, the life in the ocean, and the cycling. So we need to try it. We need to understand what species work and what places work, because after all, permaculture in general, and marine permaculture in particular, is a set of principles. It's a framework. And you take local species of foundational seaweeds and local forage fish, and you are able to regenerate an ecosystem based on that. So these design principles can work in a variety of ecosystems across the planet. And we need to adapt the general principles that work to a particular environment, a particular ecosystem. And that'll vary from one place to the next, but the principles remain: that of primary production, of creation of habitat and food, and regenerating life in the oceans and ecosystems on the planet.
This is absolutely incredible. I want to develop or get or see some diagrams of the freshwater designs so that we can get them out there. I have so many people who are working in riparian settings, who are trying to bring back wetlands, and to have these technologies to either inform that or coincide with that is so powerful. So I'm just so stoked. This is going to be amazing.
Wonderful.
Oh, man. Well, I mean, you're addressing the elephant in the room. This is when I got into permaculture, I was so excited, so stoked. And then as I started analyzing Bill's work in depth and started examining the holes in it, there was an ocean-sized hole. And a lot of people hate hearing that. They're like, no, Bill Mollison was divine and perfect. And it's like, no, he's just a guy doing research, and he's a great guy. He's an amazing genius, no doubt, no doubt. But he missed the whole ocean. You know what I mean?
Ah.
So it's like grains of salt or salt shakers, carry them around with you always. But it's like we need to let go of dogma of being stuck in a PDC structure only of permaculture. PDC is a wonderful introduction to permaculture, and it should also include ocean from now on. But it's just the beginning, and to have these career paths, to have these this exponential growth and expansion of the vision of permaculture. Like you said, these principles are universal. They don't just go into the ocean, they go into our social lives, they go into our business, our economy, our government. And this is a real turning point, I believe, in human history, is this understanding that these principles can be applied to everything. So
that's so true. To me, I take great solace in the fact that Bill Mollison discovered permaculture in the Tasmanian rainforest observing marsupials. And it's the very same Tasmanian kelp forest that we're pioneering marine permaculture in partnership with the University of Tasmania. So what an incredible full circle. I mean, going from the soils to the seas and figuring out how to make that marine ecosystem work. To me, it's just coming home. And it's coming home in such a fundamental way, being able to regenerate the marine ecosystems and the marine kelp forests and the marine seaweed farms using permaculture principles. That to me gets us up in the morning.
Absolutely. It's the next step. It's, I mean, yeah, it's the next step in the progression, and it's a massive step. It's a giant step.
Sure. You know, while we are growing food, while we're regenerating ecosystems, we can also measure the carbon export. It turns out I was in Indonesia, actually snorkeling around on the edge of the coastline, and I found these incredible seagrasses, and within one 10 square meter patch, I found a thriving seagrass bed, seaweed area, and coral reef, all living together. People think of these as competing, but they're helping each other. That was the amazing thing to see that, right? And I also noticed that with every tide, there was tons of seagrass floating to the surface and drifting out on the tide into deep water where it sinks and forms this huge carbon sink that nobody's counting, right? They only count the carbon that's right there. Okay. Well, if you get out in the trenches, you see seagrass, you see seaweed, you see kelp sitting thousands of meters below the surface. Okay. Feeding the ecosystem down there. There's all this biomass down there. And so it's the non-local export of seagrasses and kelp forests that account for most of the carbon sequestration. If you want a blue carbon sink, I can't think of anything better, right? Because you take the blue carbon, it goes out to the deep ocean on the tide, and it sinks. And so, you know, we probably help that along with offshore marine permaculture. We'll have a harvesting ship that's able to process the seaweed, and then the residue seaweed, the residual seaweed, will sink hundreds of meters a day into the deep ocean. In 2 days, it's going to be sequestered. We can measure that and measure that carbon export, which has been going on for millions of years. This is really just bringing back that natural process and measuring it. And when we measure it, we'll be able to determine the amount of carbon. I know that we're able, in just a natural kelp forest, to fix 3,000 tons of carbon per 100 hectares per year. And that's huge. I mean, it's an enormous amount of carbon. It turns out to be more carbon per square meter than a tropical rainforest. So the tropical rainforests of California are right off the coast. All those kelp forests fixing thousands of tons per square kilometer per year. And that's what we have to think of the kelp forest as. It's not only one of these richest ecosystems, but it fixes more carbon than any other ecosystem on the planet. So it's awesome. And by mimicking nature's ecosystems, we call it ecosystem biomimicry. Okay, that's what we're doing. We got to mimic the entire ecosystem. And when we do that, do a good job of it, we can feed the planet, we can regenerate nature and those nature's ecosystems, and we can measure the carbon.
So what's so incredible is that in the end result, it is a soil-based system as well. And everyone talks about how soil is so important. It's like, well, the oceans have their own soil. And I've heard from mycologists that I mean, they know that there's fungi, they know that there's bacteria, but basically they said that the ocean floor is like a giant fungal digestion like mat. And that as these carbonaceous materials, these organic matter comes into it, it gets sequestered very quickly, as you said, like 2 days, and it's there. It's not leaving. I mean, it's done. And for many of us, we talk about how there's no way. This is the closest thing to it.
Well, it is really long term. The carbon that goes below 1,000 meters has a median time to outcropping of between 100 and 4,000 years. And it depends on where you are and all the rest. But fundamentally, there are microorganisms, including fungi, including bacteria and eukaryotes, that will respire the carbon that's down there in most places of the ocean. And it turns back into carbon dioxide, but it stays in the seawater, and that seawater doesn't outcrop until centuries later. And that's the natural cycle of carbon in the oceans. There's 50 times more carbon in the oceans today than the whole atmosphere. So restoring that cycle is something that there's plenty of room to do. And it's something that we need to do in order to ensure that we've got carbon balance in the atmosphere and the oceans don't overheat. And so that's the key thing, is to keep the whole system running. The biological pump has been doing a great job for millions of years. And we just need to ensure that it can continue to do that job because, life in the ocean has been giving us a 30% discount on our carbon emissions for the past 2 centuries. And if we're not careful, that discount's going to end.
Absolutely. And the oxygen with it.
Right. So it's vital. And, that's how the Permian extinction happened. It was from anoxia. So we've got to keep the overturning circulation going to avoid the Permian extinction repeat.
So how can permaculturists everywhere support, participate, and learn more?
Well, we're doing the development right now, and I'm very happy to announce that we've got a partnership with the Intrepid Foundation, which is helping to support the kelp forest restoration in Tasmania. And so we've got this fundraiser right now. It's called, I think, Intrepid Foundation Seaweed. And what they're doing is matching dollar for dollar every contribution that goes into this, up to $250,000. And that's going to be enough to demonstrate that the kelp forest grows back. We're developing a super kelp, warm adapted variety from the eastern Tasmanian kelps that have survived. And that super kelp in combination with the higher nutrient levels that are available near the fish pens will be the beginning of marine permaculture light, which is going to be the beginning of getting it to work all over. And right now, we're very thankful to the Intrepid Foundation for matching dollar for dollar any contributions that come in. And then furthermore, we've got this new film coming out, 2040, which is all about these design principles. And then ultimately, it's going to be about having a decentralized way to apply marine permaculture on a hectare by hectare basis. And we'll have to figure out, how does that work in a distributed way? What does it look like? Do we have a CSA where we've got a shared resource of an upwelling system that can be shared across 100 hectares, and you can have 100 hectare plots? These kind of things are all possible in the future, ultimately to the point where you can build a community that's going to have offshore a huge upwelling system. You could be doing hundreds or thousands of hectares, and suddenly seasteading is thriving because you've got this huge agricultural metropolis, if you will, of California. It's a floating island of life. So that's the vision that I see as we go forward.
Wow, that is a powerful, powerful vision. And I am so...
Thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you for coming on and taking the time to inspire us and give us, some of the deepest hope. I think that when we talk about the ocean, it is this ocean-sized problem and it's intimidating. But when we look at the potential of flipping that problem into a solution, it is even greater, it's so massive. So thank you for riding that wave, for taking on this massive challenge, because you're leading. I mean, no one's doing this. This is so critical. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Matt. It's a real pleasure.